All right. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for coming. Happy Conflict Resolution Day. My name is Jason Eliezer. I'm with the Alternative Dispute Resolution Office here at the Department of Energy. Welcome to this ADR Lunchtime Series, and thank you all so much for attending. This is a speaker series presented by the Interagency Alternative Dispute Resolution Working Group in coordination with the Department of Energy ADR Office. The ADR office is committed to providing ADR services and promoting the use of ADR throughout the DOE complex, including through this regular lunchtime series, where we shall share developments and insights into the world of ADR. I'm sure that we're lucky enough today to be joined by my co-host, Adam Kerfman, who I'm sure many of you may recognize. Adam, thank you so much for coming back to the ADR office for this special event and joining to host with me today. Before we begin, Adam and I want to briefly take a moment to say thank you to everybody in attendance, and especially to those whose efforts made today possible. In particular, Kimberly Jenkins Chapman, the ADR office director here at the DOE, and our ADR office teammates, Julia Duffy, Isabella Faraz, and Sarah Pritchett. Sarah, in particular, who is single-handedly responsible for coordinating this talk today. She really did everything. And we're happy to announce that Sarah is happily now on parental leave. We'd also like to thank Lee Blackard, our technical support wizard, as well as our colleagues in the Interagency ADR Working Group who support and help spread awareness for this lunchtime series. For those of you who are within the DOE complex, please consider joining our distribution list to be advised of all of our offerings throughout the year, including future lunchtime series, our supervisor forum, our ADR open enrollment workshops, our quarterly newsletter, and all our other events and announcements. Simply email us at adroffice@hq.doe.gov to request to be added to the list. If you're on our list, please do keep an announcement for our needs assessment coming up so you can tell us what kinds of workshops and trainings you'd like to see in the new year. For those of you joining us from other agencies and organizations, welcome. Great to have you here. Great to see you. We also have a list open to the public for updates regarding this lunchtime series specifically. So please email us at that same address to be kept up to date on future lunchtime series events like this one. With that having been said, I'm going to pass it off to you, Adam.
Thanks, Jason, and it's great to be back. Hi, everyone. Happy Conflict Resolution Day. And to celebrate, before we begin the presentation, to celebrate the importance of today, we actually have a short message from the Department of Energy's Chief of Staff, Christopher Davis.
Hello, everyone. I'm Christopher Davis, Chief of Staff at the Department of Energy, and welcome to DOE's celebration of Conflict Resolution Day. I want to thank DOE's Alternative Dispute Resolution Office for hosting today's program in coordination with the Interagency Alternative Dispute Resolution Working Group. The mission and work of the Department of Energy could not be more vital or urgent, from leading the nation's clean energy transition to safeguarding the nuclear stockpile. The work we do at DOE is fun and filled with discovery and innovation, but like any workplace, it can be stressful and result in disagreement and conflict among members of the DOE team. Such conflict, if left unresolved, can negatively impact our ability to achieve our mission as an agency. But if we manage it properly, conflict can serve as a catalyst for improving communication and collaboration. The Secretary and I encourage you to use alternative dispute resolution as a way to prevent and resolve disputes in a fair, timely, equitable, and cost-effective manner. This technique includes methods such as mediation, consultation, and facilitated discussion, which may be used to resolve conflict at the earliest opportunity and at the lowest possible level. As the workplace continues to evolve, we remain committed to providing all DOE employees with the tools and resources to collaborate, find creative solutions to complicated problems, and build healthy work environments and relationships. Whether online or face-to-face, we will continue to nurture a culture in which we all feel recognized, cared for, and supported. Healthy workplaces are catalysts for progress and growth, and we hope that all employees, both DOE employees and employees from other federal agencies, can incorporate alternative dispute resolution in their work throughout the year. Thank you all for joining us today.
All right, great. Well, thank you to the Chief of Staff, Mr. Davis, for those remarks. Now we'd like to go ahead and get started with our presentation. Please feel free to send any substantive questions for the speaker to Jason and me in the chat. We expect to have several minutes at the end of the presentation for some Q&A and discussion with Dr. Franco. For any technical difficulties, please direct your inquiry via the chat again to either myself or to Jason. And you can also feel free to email us at adroffice@hq.doe.gov with any technical issues. We're extremely fortunate to have Dr. Marisa G. Franco as our speaker today on the topic of strengthening social connection, community, and collaboration, and why it matters. Dr. Franco holds a PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Maryland and works as a professor there. She writes for Psychology Today and has been a featured psychologist in the New York Times, Scientific American, NPR, and Good Morning America. She's the author of the New York Times best-selling book, Platonic: How the Science of Attachment Can Help You Make and Keep Friends. Dr. Franco takes a data-driven look at community and connection and speaks to private companies, universities, and nonprofit organizations all over the country about finding and keeping new friends as adults, making work friends in a digital-only world, and overcoming loneliness. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Franco.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone. So I'm just so excited to be talking to you about this topic. I was just telling Jason before this call started that I actually did work for the government for 2 years myself. I was at Millennium Challenge Corporation, in case any of you have heard of it. And I feel like I did a pilot for this talk there. I was like, how to make friends at work. But since then, it's kind of evolved. I've had my book come out, added some things. So hopefully this can be of high value to all of you who are on the call today. So we're talking about strengthening social connection, community, and collaboration, and why it matters. First, just wanted to say a quick thank you to all the folks that invited me to come here today and talk to you all on this, the day of grand conflict resolution. So Jason, Adam, Sarah, Lee, Kimberly. I know Sarah's out for maternity leave, but hopefully spiritually she's receiving my thank you right now, and all the rest of you, thank you as well. Okay, so I just wanted to quickly start with how I became passionate about the topic of friendship specifically, and kind of the idea of finding a larger community outside of just nuclear family. So what I'm sharing with you here is from this wellness group that I started with my friends. So I went through a breakup in my young 20s, and I felt so bad about it that I decided to start this wellness group. And the kind of format for it was that each of my friends each week would host us and choose an activity of wellness and lead us all in it. So you can see here on February 19th, I had hiking, Michael Ann had face masks, Bree had game night. And the wellness group was so transformative for me. And it wasn't because of the wellness, the hiking, and the face mask and the game night. It was just being in community with people that I loved, who loved me every week. And I guess it made me question some of the beliefs that I had about love, about connection, which was that romantic connection was the only connection that really mattered. And I didn't need to have friends or a larger community, but I just looked around at my friends and I was like, wow, why doesn't this love matter? This feels so deep and so powerful for me. And so I felt like my own experience was just part of this larger cultural experience where, it's assumed that we only need one form of connection instead of larger community. For me, it was like, I don't feel lovable unless I have this one form of connection, and I'm disregarding all the other ways that connection comes into my life. And so I wanted to be part of changing this larger cultural issue. And that is why I wrote my book, Platonic, on the science of making friends, and building larger community. And so I'm going to be talking to you about some highlights in relationship to this topic today. We're going to talk about why we need community. We're going to talk about myths about making friends, steps to making friends, and how to apply these steps. Throughout this whole presentation, we're going to take a research-backed approach to the topic of making and keeping friends. I should also mention at the end of this presentation, which will last about an hour, we'll also have some time for a Q&A. Okay, so let's frame the problem. This is data on how many friends people had in 1990 versus 2021. As you can see from this chart, in 1990, about 1 out of every 3 people, 33% of people had 10 or more friends. By 2021, that value was thirded, down to 13% of people who have 10 or more friends. And you can see the amount of people who had no friends in 1990 was just 3%, and in 2021, 4 times as many people have no friends. These statistics are intensified for men compared to 1990. By 2021, 5 times as many men have no friends. And you may be wondering, is this because of the pandemic? But actually, these trends have been happening since about the 1950s. What happened in the 1950s? The creation of the television. I won't have time to go through a history of loneliness, but if that's something that you're interested in, ask me about it in the Q&A. But we've just been experiencing this friendship recession, this friendship crisis, where our friendships have been decreasing over time. This is a trend that was slightly exacerbated in the pandemic, but has been longstanding. And I think that this is a really big problem for us because connection is vital for both physical and mental health. So this study looked at differences between people who are very happy and very unhappy. And it looked at what's the most marked feature that differentiates between these two groups. They looked at things like how much does each group exercise, how spiritual is each group, but they found that the most pronounced difference between the very unhappy and the very happy was how much connection they had in their lives, such that the people that were the happiest had much more connection than the people that were least happy. This was a study of over 100,000 people in the UK, and it looked at 106 factors that predicted rates of depressive symptoms. And the number one factor that predicted decreased rates of depressive symptoms was having someone to confide in. So confidant, that's, I just want to make sure I clarify that term, because that's not just a friend, right? That's someone that you share, you're vulnerable with, you share deeply with, you share what's on your mind, you unburden yourself around, and that's actually been found to be one of the factors that diminishes depression the most, showcasing the importance of connection for our mental health. But what people don't tend to see is that connection also has a strong impact on our overall physical health. When we are connected, we release the hormone oxytocin, which is also considered the fountain of youth by researchers. So the same hormone released when we're connected is also the hormone that keeps us young. In contrast, when we're lonely, it triggers our cortisol, stress hormone release. It triggers our HPA axis, kind of stress axis in our bodies. And the commonly cited statistic is on loneliness is that it's actually as toxic as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. I'll pause with that statistic because I don't know any of you, but I imagine that most of you would never smoke 15 cigarettes a day, right? But all of us have gone through bouts of loneliness. And so it is vital, I would say, to our overall physical health and well-being that we are taking care of ourselves in the realm of connection. Just some evidence of the relationship between connection and physical health. This study exposed volunteers to the common cold virus, and it tracked them, and it's looked at, all right, out of the people that were exposed to the virus, who is actually going to get the common cold? And it found that those who had engaged in severe conflict were 2.5 times more likely to catch the cold when exposed to the virus compared to those that were not exposed. Smokers were 3 times more likely to catch the virus, but people with less diverse social ties were 4.2 times more likely to catch the common cold when exposed to the virus. And so our immune system is compromised when we are in a decreased state of connection. Now, my students, they're really smart. They get this data and they asked if maybe, well, if they don't have as diverse social network, they're not exposed to, as many germs. But they found that it wasn't about the number of people could have interacted with the same amount of people, but if those people weren't part of their social network, they were still a lot more susceptible to the common cold. So it wasn't just about you're not exposed to as many people and not as many germs. It's just that you have fewer people in your network who you feel connected to, and that makes you more vulnerable to the common cold. This blew my mind. I mean, one of my students, I teach a class on loneliness. That's the students that I'm referencing. And she was doing this, I make them create these solutions to the loneliness crisis. And she brought this data to my attention that when people received the flu vaccine, it was less effective. They had a poorer antibody response 1 month and 4 months after the vaccine if they were more lonely. And so to just bring this all home, meta-analyses that have tracked our longevity over time have found that predictably exercise does decrease our rate of death by 23 to 30%, diet by 24%, but having a larger social network actually decreases our mortality by a whopping 45%, almost the rate of diet and exercise combined in terms of the power of social network for decreasing our mortality. My students hear this data and they're like, oh, so I could just sit at home, eat cheese doodles, and hang out with my friends. And I'm like, okay, that probably shouldn't be the takeaway here. We should probably try to engage in all of these important public health measures at once, but just make sure that you're not avoiding social connection, right? Because, I think many of us in DC, we might be like amongst the healthiest cities. And so we do spend that time exercising or thinking about our health, but we don't necessarily consider social connection as a vital and a critical part of our overall health and well-being. Just because it's Conflict Resolution Day, I wanted to dig up some data on the importance of connection for conflict. This study is actually on adolescents, and it found, as you can see from this chart here, that the more that adolescents had engaged in conflict in their relationships, the more likely they were to engage in delinquency, right? But this relationship was a lot stronger for when people had a high negativity relationship. So when they were in a kind of lower quality friendship, then conflict was a lot more likely to contribute to delinquency. But when they were in this higher quality friendship, the low negativity one right here, right, the more they engaged in conflict, it was less likely to increase their rate of delinquency over time. So basically, that when these adolescents engage in more conflict, it contributed to their rates of delinquency, but much, much more so if they didn't have the foundation of a positive relationship. And what does that mean? That investing positively in our friendships sets the stage for us to have healthy conflict. Like how you might respond to someone in a conflict situation who is your friend versus someone who's a stranger will be very different, even if they're saying the exact same thing, because one, you have built a friendship with them. And part of building a friendship is that implies trust. It implies mutuality, which means you want to succeed in the conflict, but you want them to succeed as well. You're considering your needs, you're considering their needs as well. And so I think part of our ability to engage in really healthy conflict is being able to build those relationships so that when we do have the conflict, it will go better. Okay, so I wanted to kind of just quickly spend some time tackling why we need an entire community. Because many of us have received messages growing up that, friendship is kind of this purgatory between when you leave your nuclear family and you find your next nuclear family, and we should invest all of this time. I'm sorry, I just have to acknowledge I live off Georgia Avenue and it is an ambulance hotspot. Hello, DC. And so a lot of us have been fed these messages that we kind of just need one type of connection to be happy. And we see how this plays out. This is data on how we spend our time, right? And so as we get older, we tend to spend more time with our partners and more time alone, and we spend less and less time with friends, less and less time with family outside of our partners. And so we see here with this data on friends that around 25 is the time, 20 to 25, we spend most of our time with friends. And then even throughout our lives, even in our old age when we get retired and we might have more time, we don't tend to resuscitate these connections or experience the same amount of time with our friends as we did when we were younger. So a lot of us, I guess, according to this data, tend to be relying on this one partner here rather than the larger community down here. And I think that if we're relying on one person rather than larger community to get our social needs met, then it can really hurt us. And one of the reasons why is because there's actually 3 different types of loneliness. I don't know about you, but during the pandemic, I was living with a partner and I was feeling kind of like uneasy or dysphoric. It was kind of hard for me to wrap my head around, like, what am I feeling? But when I would go for these walks with friends, I feel like I would just inflate with life and get so happy. And I started to recognize that, oh, I think what I'm feeling is a form of loneliness. Just being around this person, even while we're getting along, I still feel kind of lonely. And realizing that, one of the reasons we need larger community is to self actualize because, my partner at the time, he liked World War II documentaries. I do not like World War II documentaries. I like reality TV and learning languages. He did not like those things, right? And so there were these parts of ourselves that would really just coordinating inward and sort of collapsing because we couldn't fully express them around each other. And we needed larger community to express these different sides of ourselves that we didn't necessarily have in common with each other. And so that's why I feel like friendship, community is just central for us feeling like we are fully ourselves. And just some research to back this up. Researchers that have studied loneliness have actually identified 3 different types of loneliness. So there's intimate loneliness, which is a desire for a close, intimate connection. There's relational loneliness, which is the desire for people as close to you as a friend. And then there's collective loneliness, which is the desire to be part of a group working toward a common goal, like the soccer team, like the place of worship. So in the pandemic, maybe I wasn't experiencing as much intimate loneliness, but a lot of us might have been experiencing this relational loneliness, this collective loneliness, because modern society has buried this truth that's always been true, which is just that we, as social creatures, need an entire community to feel whole. The other thing, just wanted to mention really quickly, because I feel like sometimes friendships and spouses are really pitted against one another when I think one relationship actually facilitates the other, that the more that you have friends outside of your spouse, the better your relationship with your spouse is going to be. And just some support for this, conflict with spouse was linked to unhealthy release of cortisol, the stress hormone, the next day, but only for those who didn't have quality connection outside the marriage. So for those people that had quality connection outside the marriage, they were less physiologically impacted by conflict within their marriage. And so that quality connection, it's key. It's key for regulating us, it's key for buffering us, and it allows us to come back and return to our relationship with our spouse with more resources, more grounded from a place of greater calm. We also find some research on other significant others that finds that when you turn to different people to fulfill, sorry, one second. When you turn to different people, it's like I got exposed to that common cold virus in this study. Okay, so when you turn to different people to fulfill unique emotional needs, like let's say I go to one friend when I'm angry, I go to another friend when I'm excited and I want to see them amplify my excitement, another friend when I'm sad, that is linked to greater well being. If you're just going to one person to help you deal with all of your emotions, likely, well, they just might not be as good at helping you work through all of these different emotions. And so you're not getting your needs met as well versus when you rely on different people. It's called emotion chips. And so this research actually found that, if I interact with a friend, I exhibit less depressive symptoms. But not only that, so does my spouse. My spouse is also less likely to be depressed when I'm interacting with my friends. So the joy that I get from that form of connection actually spills over to my marriage, and makes my spouse happier as well. Well, less depressed, I should say. So, although recently a lot of us have received messages about just needing nuclear family, and that's enough in terms of connection. And I think just wanted to mention quickly, and we can go into the Q&A more deeply, that men tend to be even more vulnerable to this dynamic of getting into a relationship or a marriage and not prioritizing friendship as well. And there's complex societal reasons for that. Again, happy to go into that in the Q&A. But this is an anomaly in the history of the Western world. In fact, in the early 1800s and before, people got married because someone would give them resources and their family thought it was a good idea for their reputation. But it was assumed that you could only deeply connect with people of your gender. And so friendship was where people really experienced the deepest form of love, and friends would hold hands and write their names into trees. And, Marsilio Ficino, he was an Italian scholar, and he actually created the term platonic. And I think sometimes we think of platonic love as romantic love with some screws missing. But in his definition, platonic love was a love divine enough to transcend the physical, right? It was so beautiful in its own right because it didn't include that physicality. And I love his way of thinking about platonic love because it really highlights that different types of connection are each give us their own offerings and are each really important in their own right, which is why we need larger community. And so he's quoted as saying, "For it does not desire this or that body, but desires the splendor of the divine light shining through bodies." Okay, I love this quote from Esther Perel. I don't know if any of you all are familiar with her, but she's a very popular therapist who's written a couple of books, Mating in Captivity, The State of Affairs. I was fangirling last week because I actually got to speak with her at a conference at Bard, and it was amazing. She had actually been traveling for like 3 months all over the world visiting her friends, and she like loves to stay in their apartments instead of hotels. And she kind of has a similar message of like we need an entire community rather than just one person. And so she has this quote that I really love, which is, "The quality of our relationships determines the quality of our lives." Okay, so hopefully I have convinced you. Friend community is important, but that doesn't mean that we know how to make friends. So how exactly do you do that? I'm going to be going through some myths that some of us may have in regards to friendship that may be harming our ability to make friends. And the first myth is this idea that friendship connection should just happen organically. I shouldn't have to try. This is a picture of me when I was going to college. I went to New York University. I use myself as an example here because I got everything wrong when it came to friendship. I thought all of these myths were true. I was scared of making friends when I was going to get to college, but I just thought to myself, well, it's just going to happen. It's going to happen organically, and I'm not going to have to try, right? But I wish someone told me about some of the data I'm about to present to you. So I think the reason that a lot of us think that friendship should happen organically is because when we were young, it felt like it did. And that's because when we were kids, we were on the playground, we're like, hey, be my friend. We're sitting next to each other at lunch. Ooh, we're friends, Jim, right? We had these three conditions that sociologist Rebecca Adams considers necessary for friendship to happen organically. This includes proximity, or being located near someone, or if you want a fun research term for this, propinquity, which is just the idea that nearness creates connection. If I'm near you in space over time, I'm more likely to be your friend. Repeated unplanned interaction, so I see you in a repeated way and neither of us had to plan it, kind of like work or school, for example. But then we also have to get vulnerable with each other. And so I think for a lot of us, we no longer inhabit an environment with these ingredients. So, we might see each other every day at work here at the Department of Energy, but you may or may not be vulnerable with your colleagues, actually confiding in them. A lot of the times at work, I obviously can't speak on the culture at the Department of Energy. But I think in general, a lot of times when we're at work, we're sort of only talking about the work. We're only disclosing this one side of ourselves, this side of ourselves that's knowledgeable on the topic at hand. And we're not as dimensional as a person. We're not sharing who we are as a human being. And so what this means is that friendship doesn't happen organically anymore in adulthood because we're no longer finding ourselves in environments with the ingredients for friendship to happen organically. And so, if we rely on the same set of assumptions that we had when we were kids about how connection and community happens, we might be vulnerable to not having community. Support Support for this claim comes from one study. This was on older adults in Canada and looked at their beliefs around how connection happened and their loneliness. And the study found that people who thought friendship was made based on luck, so organically, were actually lonelier 5 years later. But people who thought friendship was made based on effort, so they were active about their friendships, were less lonely 5 years later. Why is that? Because the people that thought that friendship happened based on effort were just more likely to make the effort. They were more likely to volunteer. They were more likely to show up at a place of worship, right? And so that's why this belief that it should just happen for me, it should be organic, can really harm us because when we think it should happen organically, we don't try. And we need to try in adulthood. Rates of loneliness are anywhere from 30 to 50% in the United States, right? So, what that means is that if you're very passive about connection, you're likely to end up in this very large bunch of us that is lonely. We have to swim against these tides of disconnection to make friends. But when I told you all that you have to try, some of you may have been like, oh my gosh, Dr. Franco, that's scary. People are scary. I don't want to get rejected by people. People are going to think I'm weird. People are going to think I'm clingy. I have heard it all regarding our fears when it comes to connection. And so, just to soothe some of these fears, I wanted to share a little bit of research. This is a study on something called the liking gap, which had strangers interact in a number of different environments. It was on a college campus, it was in a personal development workshop. And after these strangers interacted, they were asked, hey, how much do you like that person? How much do you think they like you? And they found that across the board, people tended to underestimate how liked they were by the other person. This is called the liking gap. People like us more than we think. Now, you may be thinking, well, I'm weird, I'm awkward, I have the worst social anxiety, I still haven't recovered since the pandemic, right? And the research actually found that for people that are particularly self critical, this liking gap was even more pronounced. So sometimes we think our self criticism is telling us the truth that people really don't want to connect with us, when this research actually suggests that our critical voice is even more greatly distorting the truth, which is that people like us a lot more than we think. This was an interesting study where people were basically asked to open up conversation with others on a commute. For some of you, that may be your biggest fear. I don't want anyone to talk to me on the metro. That's why I keep my headphones in, or on the bus. And the researchers were really interested in, people actually predicted that they would enjoy the commute more if it was in solitude. But when they were asked to talk to people on the commute, they actually enjoyed the commute more than when they were in solitude. So, the finding behind this study is that we underestimate just how much we'll enjoy social connection. So I have a friend and he's an introvert, and I told him about this research and he said, so now instead of asking myself, do I want to go to this social thing? I ask myself, will I have been happy that I went to this social thing, knowing that our predictive mechanisms here are off. But what I really wanted to mention about this study is that out of all the participants who were told to open up conversation on this commute, none of them were turned down. Absolutely none of them. And so this was a quote from the study. Commuters appear to think that talking to a stranger posed a meaningful risk of social rejection. As far as we can tell, it posed no risk at all. Now, when I tell my students about this study, they're like, what city was that in? Couldn't have been Washington, D.C. Couldn't have been New York City. This study was actually in Chicago, but there's recent research that involved having people talk to strangers, and it found that people predicted that about 40% of the time strangers would be open to talking to them, but actually it was about 90% of the time strangers were open and interested in talking to them. So generally, we see the research telling us that we are a lot less likely to get rejected than we predict. So, one of my tips when it comes to making friends is to try to assume that people are going to like you. Now, I know this is a hard assumption to make, right? It's easy to get afraid of people, it's easy to fear rejection. I think it's fine for us to have that voice inside of us, but just leaning into we have multiple voices inside of us, and there's another voice that might say, hey, what if this goes well? What if they're open to connecting? And choosing to focus our attention on that voice. The reason that I tell people to assume that people will like them is based off of research on something called the acceptance prophecy. This is basically this finding that when people are told, hey, based on your personality profile, you are going to go into this group and be liked. Now, this is a lie, researchers using their deception, but what they find is that people who think they'll be liked go into that group and are friendlier, warmer, more open. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so this is a quote from the study on this acceptance prophecy. If people expect acceptance, they will behave warmly, which in turn will lead other people to accept them. Now, if I'm asked, who's the type of person that's most likely to reject you? My answer often surprises people because I believe, based on my view of the research, that the people that are most likely to reject you are the people that fear rejection the most themselves. Now, take a moment and think about the last time you feared being rejected. How did you act? So I'll just give an example from my own life. So on my faculty, we have these social lunches where we kind of meet up and we have lunch together. And I was in charge of them last year. I started the social committee, very predictable based on my research. But this year, when we're at these lunches, everybody was on their computers doing work. And I just started to feel rejected because I was just hoping to connect with everybody, but everybody was behind a screen. And I found myself both getting quieter, wanting to withdraw and not come back to these social lunches, and also um, getting kind of angry with the people around me and upset with them that, hey, this is our time to socially connect and you're all withdrawing from me, right? And so, what this kind of shows me is that when I'm fearing rejection, I tend to reject people, right? That now I want to reject them back. I want to withdraw from them. I feel more hostile towards them. I feel less interested in engaging with them. But sometimes people aren't actually rejecting us, but we are perceiving it as rejection, and that will trigger that same mindset of wanting to withdraw, feeling more hostile, disliking people around you. That when we tend to assume that we will be rejected, we tend to reject people and then we get rejected back. And that's why assuming rejection is a self-fulfilling prophecy, too. So, this study had people fill out a questionnaire that assessed their social interactions over time. And they found that people that were high in something called rejection sensitivity, which means that they tend to assume they're being rejected even when the situation is ambiguous, right? So you haven't heard back from a friend's text. If you're high in rejection sensitivity, you think they hate me, they no longer want to talk to me. If you're low in rejection sensitivity, you think they're probably busy. And so those people that were high in rejection sensitivity, when they had experienced in these interactions something that could ambiguously signify rejection, let's say a friend is quieter than usual, maybe they're hungry, maybe they're tired, maybe they hate you. But they found that these people, the higher in rejection sensitivity, would respond to those ambiguous social rejections by being cold and being unfriendly, by rejecting the other person, which then would lead them to get rejected right back. So when the situation is ambiguous, right? Assume that people are going to like you because that is going to trigger a set of behaviors that will make that more likely to become true. Now, I should say this caveat here. This isn't about being obtuse. This isn't obtuse. This isn't about not reading social cues, right? I'm saying to assume, right? Assume is basically when you have limited information, your starting assumption, right? When you clearly have information that someone is not interested in talking to you, maybe they've said it to you, maybe you've reached out to them a couple times, they've still not responded. That is the time to pull away. But when it's a new person, when you don't have any data, when you have a history of connection with someone, a history of things going well, and you are now facing some sort of difficulty, trying to assume that that other person is going to like you. When you want to initiate a new connection with someone that you've been interested in becoming friends with, assuming that that person is going to like you is really going to facilitate friendship. And what we've learned from the research so far is that this is a lot more likely to be true than we think. Now, we're still on this topic of initiating friendships. And there's one more thing that I want to share. You know, some of us decide we want to find community. And we sit on our couch all day and we watch our Netflix shows and we just lament that the community hasn't happened. And for those of us who do this, we have not yet overcome something called overt avoidance. And overt avoidance is like, I'm scared of people, so I'm not going to show up. I'm not going to go to the bowling league or the bocce league or the happy hours or join the board or whatever it is because I want to connect with people, but I'm also a little scared of them. But there's others of us who are like, I want to connect with people. I want to make friends. I'm going to show up at the bocce league, at the language class, at the community meeting each week. But we still may not overcome something called covert avoidance. Covert avoidance is when you show up but check out, right? You may arrive at that Spanish class, but you're on your phone. You're leaving the second the class ends. You're talking to the one person you already knew from the last class, right? You're not actually engaging with people. And in order to find connection, initiation requires you to not just overcome overt avoidance by placing yourselves in situations that allow for connection, but also to overcome covert avoidance. You have to introduce yourself to people, engage with people. You have to say to your coworkers, what a great talk today on conflict resolution day, on friendship. It changed my life. How did you like it, right? You have to show an interest in them, and that is going to facilitate connection. So I just wanted to share a quick example of this from my own life. This was March of 2020. Things were about to change. I had just bought an apartment in Washington, D.C. And I was really excited. And I was thinking about how I bought this place. I want to invest in community and really wanted to be friends with my neighbors. And I was writing my book, Platonic, at the time. And I remember walking through the hallway. This was early March, before we were all on lockdown. I saw a neighbor in my hallway. And I thought to myself, I would love to introduce myself to her, but I'm like really scared. So I did not assume that she was going to like me. I assumed that she might reject me. And I scurried back into my apartment, thinking I might not talk to her as much as I wanted to. But then my partner at the time, who was living with me, he pushes me back into the hallway and he says, what would you tell all those people you're writing that book for? And so as I'm stumbling into the hallway, I'm thinking to myself, this isn't going to happen organically. Just because I want to be friends with my neighbor doesn't mean that I will be friends with my neighbor. And I'm thinking, oh, I'm really afraid of rejection, but maybe I'm less likely to be rejected than I think. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, I can't just stand in the hallway. That means I overcame overt avoidance. I also am going to have to actually engage with her and interact with her. So I go up to her and I say, hi, I'm Marisa. I just moved into 103. It's nice to meet you. She's super nice, super friendly, just like the research tells me she would be. And so we get to chatting, and eventually I kind of shoot my shot and I say, is there any sort of like social group that the neighbors use to keep in touch? And she says, Well, we do have this cat sitting group. And I think to myself, I guess I have to take connection in whatever form it'll come in. So I had to cat sit a lot of cats to get into that neighbors group. But every Friday of the pandemic, we hung out socially distanced in the garden behind our shared apartment. And it was life changing for me. It was a saving grace in a time of so much loneliness. And I think, the moral of the story here is that sometimes we think that one tiny act like saying hello can't change the course of our community. But I'm here to say that it absolutely can, because 6 months later, that same neighbor, Zaria, asked me to be her best friend formally. And we were actually going on a trip to Buenos Aires in January. So I hope that this is a message to all of you, to take initiative and to go for it with people that you really want to connect with, because you may end up on a trip to Buenos Aires together. Okay, so just wanted to review some tips for initiating that we've talked about so far. Overcome overt and covert avoidance. You have to find a community to engage with socially, but you also have to engage with people when you meet them. Assume that people like you, right? Try to assume that people are going to be open to you and want to hang out with you. Remember the liking gap. People are more likely to accept us than we think they are. Remember, talking to strangers, about 90% of the time, strangers were open to talking to people. I love this tip on reconnecting because people often ask me how to make friends. And when you reconnect with people from your past, who you just fell out of touch with because you got busy, for example, not because you had some major conflict, the relationship progresses a lot more quickly because you have a lot more trust. Research on reconnection matches research on the liking gap, such that when people reconnect, they underestimate how happy people are to hear from them. So I hear people say, oh, that person probably moved on with their life. They already have a family, all these things. But in fact, people are more interested in reconnecting with us than we think, than we predict. And then asking people to put you in touch with someone you might get along with. I did this when I did a solo trip to Mexico City. If you're moving cities, for example, the work of finding connection starts before you move. When you ask people in your existing network, hey, I'm going to be in this place, looking to connect with people. Do you know anyone I might get along with? And you could even do this now. Like, I'm just looking to expand my social circle. Do you know anyone I might get along with that you might be willing to put me in touch with? A lot of us, we're willing to do this for our jobs, the kind of informational interviews thing, asking our looser ties for work connections, and we can apply the same set of skills to our personal connections as well. All right, let's talk about the next myth when it comes to connecting with people. Me, right before college. I am not going to be vulnerable because then everyone is going to think I'm weak. And then they're going to think I'm a burden. And everyone wants to be friends with someone who is perfect. So I have to show people how polished I am and how perfect I am. And then they are going to want to be friends with me. That is what I thought at the time. But since then, this was specifically on college students transitioning their freshman year, I'd found that those who suppressed their emotions, were not vulnerable, went on to college and experienced less support, felt less close to others, and less satisfied in their relationships. This is a meta-analysis that combined all the existing research on intimately disclosing things about yourself and being liked. And it found that there is a positive relationship. The more people intimately self-disclosed, the more liked they are. And people also like people they intimately self-disclose to. Which is why we all really love our therapists, I hope, or switch therapists. And so it's a two-way street of connection that when we self-disclose to other people, they feel closer to us and we feel a lot closer to them. I will quickly call out, so I'm a psychologist, so I can listen to you talk all day, right? And I'm thinking people love talking about themselves, so I'm going to create a place for everybody to self-disclose, ask them questions, show interest in them. I've since come across research that reciprocal self-disclosure creates more connection than self-disclosure that's one way. So just a tip for my listeners here, my openers here who just like to ask questions but are too nervous to share anything about themselves, pushing you yourselves to not just ask those questions and use those listening skills, but to also share a little bit more about you too. So you're going to notice a trend here on the research on connection, which is that when we predict how we come across socially, we are cynical. We underestimate just how positively people receive us across the board. So this also applies to the research on vulnerability. When people thought about disclosing personal things like flaws they had in their bodies or issues that they had at work, for example, they thought that people would perceive them negatively. But when they thought about other people disclosing these things, they perceive these people more positively. And so, what this means is that when we are vulnerable, we underestimate how positively people perceive us. It is called the beautiful mess effect. People are attracted to vulnerability, and we underestimate the extent to which that is true. We underestimate the extent to which vulnerability makes other people see us as more authentic, more genuine, more open. And we overestimate the extent to which we think our vulnerability will lead people to see us as weak or flawed. Now, the other thing that's beautiful about vulnerability, and I think most aspects of human connection, is that it's something we can practice to get closer to other people, but it's also something we practice to make ourselves feel stronger. And so this is based on research on 10,000 secrets. And the researcher wanted to look at what makes people good at coping with the weight of their heavy, heavy secrets, right? For some people, they ruminate on it every day. They can't even think about it without feeling bad about themselves. They carry so much shame. Other people have a secret and it doesn't weigh on them as much, right? Maybe something they don't share, but they don't think it reflects badly on them, doesn't make them feel shame. And how do people get to that place where they're more at peace with their secrets? And so, what this study found was that the people that were best at coping with the weight of their secrets, it wasn't that they were inherently stronger than everyone else. Their secret to being good at secrets was that they had shared their secret with someone. That person responded positively, and then they internalized that positive response. And now they related to their own secrets a lot more positively. So I think in, rugged individualism in American culture, we often think being strong comes from within and being really resilient or having some aspect of your character that's really powerful. But what we see from the research on connection over and over and over again is the people that are the quote unquote strongest or most resilient, their secret is not that they did it alone. Their secret is that they've had positive relationships with other people, that they've internalized into the foundations of their very self. That's how they got strong, through connection. But I wanted to share this important caveat because the people that were worse at coping with the weight of their secrets had also shared their secrets, but they didn't receive support and they had internalized that negative response from other people. So I wanted to highlight that, when it comes to vulnerability, it's not just about being vulnerable willy-nilly. It's about being discerning. Who are the people that make us feel safe, make us feel comfortable, we have a history of a relationship with? Let ourselves be vulnerable with them. But it's not the case that we have to share our deepest, darkest secrets with everyone to establish that sense of connection. I want to acknowledge that vulnerability is a risk, but from the findings of this study, more often than not, people responded positively. More often than not, sharing secrets was beneficial for the participants. So when I interviewed this guy, Dr. Michael Slepian, who conducted the previous study, and he wrote this catchy titled book, The Secret Life of Secrets, and I asked him, hey, what's the one thing you would tell people who need help dealing with the weight of their secrets? And he said, the one thing that I would say to them is that they need to tell someone. And this relates to my own experience as getting training as a psychologist, when one of my supervisors told me, anything unspeakable to you is still affecting you. Okay, so how can we bring more vulnerability to our connections and thus deepen them? I think part of it is just asking deeper questions, right? Like sometimes we just follow this social script of like, how was your weekend? How's it going? But just letting yourself shake things up and ask something a little bit different, like, what's the last thing you learned? The last time you felt pure joy? One way you want to grow in the next year? Like, I can challenge you all if you want to take a takeaway from this presentation. Next time you interact with someone, just ask them one of these questions. It's just a little different than typical. In my faculty social group that I headed last year, I brought this calendar, and it was a calendar that every day had like a deep question. And so, one of the questions was, how has your sleep been lately? And so we all were talking about our sleep and, who has good sleep, who has not good sleep, and the things that were affecting our sleep. And then it got philosophical because we're academics, and we went on and on about this one question. But it was just really interesting to like understand this different side of my colleagues. And so freeing yourself up to ask those deeper questions. And remember that people will likely receive your vulnerability better than you think. Now, vulnerability, I just wanted to quickly acknowledge, there are grave gender differences when it comes to people's likelihood of expressing vulnerability in friendship. There was a study that came out that found that women are about twice as likely to be vulnerable with their friends in a given week compared to men. But vulnerability is necessary for all of us, no matter what our gender is, and is going to bond us closer to people no matter what. And so, I think stereotypically, at least, men tend to talk more about ideas or current events or sports with their friends. So I would challenge you to, next time you're interacting with a friend, share something that you are struggling with. Tell them what you have been struggling with, what's been on your mind, what you've been ruminating about or worrying about, and see where the conversation goes. Okay. Next myth when it comes to connection is this idea that either you click or you don't. And so this is young me deciding I'm going to college. I want to make friends. I literally go to one social group and I don't connect with anyone there. And then I quit forever, right? And I don't give anything time. And I'm thinking about nobody tried to connect with me. But I don't shift those questions around and ask myself, did I try to connect with anyone? Did I make anyone feel welcome? Did I make anyone feel like I was interested in them, right? And so I wish someone told me that when you meet new people, it's really, really normal to feel like you're interacting with someone like this. Very intense coyote eyes. But when you establish familiarity with people, how you relate to them fundamentally changes. So you begin to feel like you're interacting with this. So the research based on this comes from something called the mere exposure effect. And you are all probably a little bit familiar with the mere exposure effect. Like, when you hear a song on the radio and you're like, man, what the heck is this? And then they keep playing it, and eventually you're like, ooh, yeah, like I like this song. So the idea behind the mere exposure effect is that by merely being exposed to people over time, we come to like them more, right? That familiarity creates connection. And so the research behind this, when researchers in a large psychology lecture planted women into the lecture, at the end of the semester, nobody remembered any of those women, but when they were asked, hey, just based on your first impression, how much do you like each of these women? They found that the woman that had showed up to the most classes was liked 20% more than the woman that didn't show up for any classes. I want to emphasize that nobody remembered these women. So this was completely unconscious that people just came to like women more that they had seen more often, right? And evolutionarily, this makes sense. If you continue to be exposed to someone and they don't pose any harm to you, right, that's telling you from a threat perspective that they don't pose a danger to you and you are free to like them more. The other thing we see in the research on connection is that when people were exposed to profiles of similar women and they were told one of these women in this profile, you're going to engage in an ongoing discussion group with, and not this other woman. And the profiles were very similar aside from this little note. And they found that people reported liking the profile of the woman that they thought that they would see again. So it's not just that being repeatedly exposed to each other creates liking, but even the thought that we may be continuously exposed to each other creates more liking. And this makes sense, right? Like if I know that I'm going to see you over time, it makes sense for me to be more invested in forming a positive relationship with you because that's going to pay off for me as well. Now, just want to quickly mention, I don't know why only these women are in these profiles, and we don't get any profiles of men in some of these studies because we need to figure out these dynamics with men too. So hopefully, men, you have your day in the psychology research on friendship. So just some tips based off of this research, right? Expect connection to feel uncomfortable at first. When I tell people to join a social group to create connection, I also have to tell them it's going to feel uncomfortable the first few times. The problem is sometimes we take that as a sign to escape the connection, to not try anymore, to eject. But we know from the mere exposure effect that, hey, this is normal for us to feel uncomfortable, weary, mistrusting in the beginning, and that it gets more comfortable over time. So I usually tell people, unless you're really just dreading it and you really hate this social group, try to show up for about 2 months before you make a decision, because likely your experience of it is going to shift over time. The other thing I tell people is make friends from repeated events, right? Instead of single events. If you want to create connection, don't just go to a lecture or a happy hour because that's a lot of pressure on one event to create a connection. Whereas we know from the mere exposure effect that if we have the opportunity to see people more repeatedly, we're a lot more likely to feel connected to them. So join a class, be friends with your neighbor because you already have mere exposure effect. Be friends with your colleagues because you already have that mere exposure effect. Be more strategic about trying to connect with people where you have that, remember that repeated unplanned interaction at the beginning of this presentation? One of the steps for friendship to happen more organically. Yes, and then making friends with people that you already see regularly, like your neighbors or your coworkers. After Zaria became one of my closest friends, now I move into my new apartment, knock on my neighbor's door, say, hey, it's great to meet you. I just wanted to welcome you. Here's a bottle of wine. Thanks so much for, I'm so happy that you're coming into this apartment. I just wanted to invite you over to welcome you further and so we can get to know one another. And, I don't always become best friends with my neighbors, but generally it's really helpful, even as like little things come up, like what are each other's plans or checking in about, is your Wi-Fi out too? Because my Wi-Fi is out. So I am definitely a fan of trying to create positive relationships with people that you see regularly. Now, I also mentioned at the start of this presentation that I had created this wellness group with my friends where we saw each other regularly over time. And that's what made me feel just how powerful friendship was in my life. And you too can do this. You too can take someone that you feel connected to and say, hey, would you be open to meeting up for a weekly walk, a bi-weekly dinner? I have a book club, for example. And this may sound intimidating, so my suggestion for you is just find one other friend who might be down for this idea, and then each of you can invite one additional friend, and you can do it together. Now, in my loneliness class, I have 2 different sections, and one of them was getting so much more connected than the other one. And so I was wondering to myself, what is going on here? Why is one group getting so much more connected? And the one class would send me pictures of themselves all out at lunch together. And I'm like putting on my anthropologist hat, which I made for myself because I have no formal training in anthropology. And I'm trying to understand, why is one class so much more connected than the other? And what I notice is that at the end of every class, one of my students, Savannah, says to everyone in the class, does anyone want to go to lunch? And because Savannah made that one overture for friendship, 10 other people in the class now feel more connected because Savannah is what I call an igniter. And an igniter is a person that creates social groups for other people. And an igniter is a lot of work. I say this as an igniter. But I think in a society with so much loneliness, if we have more igniters, we are going to change the face of loneliness because igniters not only create connection for themselves, but they create more connection for everyone else around them. And so here's my invitation to you for you to become an igniter and to say to a friend, hey, I'm going to have a few friends over on Wednesday. You don't know each other yet, but I think you might be getting along. would you be open to doing a regular monthly meetup at this time? Recently had a friend ignite over this psychology concept called self-compassion, which is the opposite of self-criticism. It's kind of treating yourself with tenderness and kindness. And so she set up a weekly Zoom on Wednesdays for us to all do self-compassion together. But I am so full of these sort of, I call it my social infrastructure in my life. I've had this monthly dinner group where we meet up once a month just to try different restaurants in DC. As I write my books, I'm actually writing a new book now on the science of worthiness. I have a book critique group where we basically meet up every month and critique each other's books. My wellness group has now evolved to a bi-weekly dinner group. We're doing a Halloween brunch. And the beautiful thing about social infrastructure, like creating these groups of connection, is that you recreate those conditions for friendship to happen more organically. You have that repeated unplanned interaction. You have that proximity, and you can feel like you can let your guard down. Okay, let's talk about the last myth when it comes to connection, and then we can open things up for the Q&A, which is this idea that to be liked, I need to be the coolest, the funniest, or the smartest. I remember when I was going to college, I was thinking to myself, I'm smart and insightful. I'm just going to go and say insightful things, and everybody will want to be friends with me, right? And turns out this isn't an admittedly egotistical and not quite the best tactic for making friends. Because now, since I've studied human connection, I understand that making friends is less about who you are and more about how you treat people. People want to be friends with someone that makes them feel valued and someone that makes them feel like they matter. And so, showing love to people, showing affection to them is what nurtures friendship. And this study tracked friendship pairs over time to look at, hey, which of these pairs is the friendship deepening and which of these pairs is it fizzling out? And it found that one of the deciding factors was affection. That those pairs where people had shared this affection towards one another were a lot more likely to sustain and endure over time. This study looked at differences between people that were high in affirming others and low in affirming others. And so high and low affirmers filled out a bunch of different questionnaires related to a number of different concepts. And they found that the high affirmers were just doing so much better socially. They were less isolated, they had fuller social calendars, and they were more likely to receive more affection right back. They also got more dates and they were less depressed. So just like I said, how vulnerability creates connection, but also is going to benefit your mental health, affirmation is going to do that as well. So this was a study that literally tested what do people report is the most important quality that they're looking for in a friend. And out of the 8 qualities that they had listed, the number one quality for both men and women was something called ego support, which was basically they wanted friends that make them feel valued, make them feel like they could believe in themselves, that they're a good person, they could achieve their goals, a friendship that was really supporting them, a friend that was making them feel cherished and important. Now, the factor that I thought was most important, which was being entertaining or interesting or charismatic, was actually the least important factor people reported in a friend. This idea of narrative skill where you're witty, you could come up with jokes and be really entertaining. That was the least important thing people wanted in their friendships. So the theory behind this that I really love is just this idea called risk regulation theory. And risk regulation theory basically argues that we decide how much to invest in a relationship based on our view of how likely we are to get rejected. So if we think we're going to get rejected, we don't invest anything. If we think we're going to be accepted, we will invest a lot more. And so if we think we are going to be rejected, we find ourselves in this pole of protecting ourselves. We are not vulnerable, we withdraw, we burn our bridges, we're more selfish, we're not initiating connections, right? This is a way to protect ourselves because connection is scary, right? But in the long run, if we're always engaging in these behaviors to protect ourselves, then we're only harming ourselves because we're not able to connect with people. Because on the alternative pole, we are protecting our relationships. And the things that we do to protect our relationships often make ourselves more vulnerable, right? And that looks like forgiving people, sacrificing in times when friends are in need, showing love and affection, being more vulnerable, initiating more interaction, right? The more we are protecting our relationships in these ways, the more we make ourselves more vulnerable, right? And so for people to want to connect with us, we have to get them to go from protecting themselves to being pro-relational, wanting to engage deeply in a relationship with us. And one of the ways that we make people feel safe enough to do that is by showing them affection, by showing interest in them, saying that, you're great. This is what you mean to me. I've really enjoyed interacting with you. I really love spending time together. That thing you said, I've just been thinking about it. I thought, it was so insightful, for example, that the more we show affection towards other people, we are basically regulating their risk of rejection. And if people decide how much to invest in a relationship based on their view of how likely they are to get rejected, the more that we can use affection to show people, I will not reject you, the closer that we can end up forming a relationship with them. So that is why affection is really powerful for creating connection. So this is all like concisely put in this theory called the theory of inferred attraction, which answers this question of what makes people likable. And the idea behind the theory is that people like people who they think like them. And so the secret to creating connection is just to show people that you like them. It's interesting because when we look at research on affection, for example, and people like write down something affectionate and they predict how it's going to come off to the person receiving it. Hopefully this is predictable to you by now, but they predict that it's going to come off as more awkward than it actually does for the receiver. And they also underestimate just how good the receiver feels from receiving that bit of affection. So your affection means more to people than you know. So just some tips to be more affirming in your life. Just going into interactions looking for something to like in people, making that your orientation to others, to look for something to value in them. When you like someone, tell them. We keep our cards so close. We don't share with people. Oh my gosh, like you're great. I've just really enjoyed our time together. It's been really special to me. Because somehow we think it comes off as weird or clingy, but it's actually an innate aspect of connection is to openly share affection with one another. Be extra thoughtful on friends' birthdays. I think of friends' birthdays as just kind of these times of permission to show more affection. So writing them a card, showing them how much you love them. Just texting your friends to say how much they mean to you, that the relationship is so important to you, that you're so happy to have them in your life. I love this send friends dinner when they're sick as a form of affection because basically, we're more likely to remember experiences of high emotion, whether good or bad. So, what that means is that when your friend is going through something really good or really bad, what you do in those moments are going to disproportionately affect your friend's memory of the friendship. So, how did you react when your friend went through a promotion? Were you like, oh, why'd they give it to you? I'm surprised. Or were you like, I'm rooting for you. That's awesome. Let me take you out to celebrate. Versus when they're sick and they're in need of support, are you intentional about checking in and say, I just want to see how you're doing. I know you've been sick. Or sending them some dinner, for example. Because connection isn't necessarily about having all the time in the world to connect with people, but it is about making the most of the time that you do have and connecting strategically in these diagnostic moments, these moments that disproportionately predict how satisfied people are in the friendship. So if your friend is going through a high or a low moment, that's a time to remind yourself to show up and be intentional about celebrating them or being there for them. So one of my friends, she just got a license as an engineer. It was like a really hard, arduous test she had to take. And she told us, and she wanted to go out to dance, but we didn't have the time to go out. But next time we met up, she was part of my wellness group and part of my biweekly dinner group. I made sure to buy her some flowers and write her a card and give the card to my other friend so that she could sign it too, so that we could just make sure that we took a moment to acknowledge this milestone in her life. Okay. So just wanted to share our overarching takeaways for today on connection. Initiate, right? Friendship doesn't happen organically in adulthood. You have to try. You have to try to assume that people will like you instead of they're going to reject you, because that's going to facilitate connection. You have to overcome covert and overt avoidance, which means find a place to show up in community around others, but also engage with people when you get there. Introduce yourself to people. Remember, they're a lot less likely to reject you than you fear. And the only way that you will know that, right? Because that study on talking to strangers, they found that when people had practiced talking to strangers like 5 times throughout the course of the study, it then became a lot easier to them. They were less afraid of it. They were more confident. And so the only way forward is through. You have to do it, and then you'll know. Disclose. Get vulnerable. Remember the beautiful mess effect. Remember that self-disclosure leads to more liking and that people are less likely to judge you than you predict. Expose. Put in the effort to see people regularly. Remember the mere exposure effect, that through merely being exposed to each other over time, that sense of familiarity creates liking. So how can you put yourself in places where you are going to have more regular exposure to one another? Maybe you want to become an igniter. Maybe you want to become the person that creates social groups wherein your friends can interact more and see each other more repeatedly. And then affirm, looking for things to like in the people around you, but not only thinking those affirmations, making sure that you're sharing them, making sure that you're telling people, I just really enjoyed spending time with you and I really value our time together. Thank you. And also making sure that you are capitalizing on those diagnostic moments when your friend's going through a high or your friend's going through a low, making sure you're very intentional about checking in and showing up for them. Okay, just because I don't know if you all know Brene Brown, but she's like a very famous social worker, and she taught me that people love acronyms. So it's the idea model of social connection, just so you can remember it. Initiate, disclose, expose, and affirm. Now we can move forward into questions. I think we have about 10 minutes left. Just a really quick note. If you want to get more tips on friendship, I share it on Instagram at Dr. Marisa G. Franco, and on my website, drmarisagfranco.com. I have a quiz that assesses your strengths and weaknesses as a friend and gives you some more detailed suggestions if you are wanting to continue to work on your connections. So thank you, everyone. I think now we can move to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Franco. It's what a wonderful talk. So much to think about. I have so many questions. Um, First question, somebody just dropped in. Can you give that acronym again, please? It was IDEA, but what does IDEA stand for? One more time.
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to post it in the chat too.
There you go.
It stands for initiate, disclose, expose, and affirm.
Amazing, amazing. So I do want to encourage everybody to drop questions into the chat, into the WebEx Q&A feature, and we will, we'll have time for hopefully all the questions we can get to here. This question came in. I know a lot of from my personal experience, I agree with this. A lot of friends and coworkers self-identify as introverts. They kind of use that as an excuse to not hang out, to stay at home on their couch watching Netflix. Is there any sort of research about the differences in the need for these relational connections between introverts and extroverts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I actually identify as an introvert, and so I get upset at people like conflating introversion with being antisocial or being socially awkward. Um, I think the introversion by definition is that you recharge by spending time alone versus extroverts who recharge, feel more energized after they spend time with other people. And you tend to see certain characteristics in introverts and extroverts. So, extroverts being more outgoing, kind of stereotypically the life of the party, introverts liking kind of smaller groups of people, more intimacy, really good at listening. And I kind of see introverts and extroverts as each having a skill set when it comes to connection, just a different one. Like extroverts may be more likely to be igniters, for example, but introverts are really good at asking those questions to create intimacy. And so I think it's about leaning into your skill set instead of assuming that one is inferior to the other. But the other thing that because I hear like introverts just wait for an extrovert to adopt them. And I think I want to emphasize that the ability to initiate a friendship is not inherent to introversion or extroversion. It is a skill, right? It's a skill that you can build no matter whether you're an introvert or extrovert. I think the issue that I see with these categories is that in the spirit of self-fulfilling prophecies, right? People just assume, oh, by nature, I cannot initiate social connections because I'm an introvert, for example. And that can become really, really self-sabotaging. So anyone could create connections, anyone can initiate connection. It's just the style of connection that we really like that differs depending on our level of introversion or extroversion.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that. That's a great answer. I love that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Franco. Uh, Another question that we received says that more workplaces have explored 4-day work weeks with 32 hours as opposed to the standard 40. And those companies or workplaces didn't notice a drop in productivity from their employees. Is there any research or have you heard anything about how that change might either improve or impact social connection?
Hmm.
Um, the user mentioned that they know that they'd do more in the community if they weren't at work 5 days a week and feeling
Oh,
pretty
that's so
tired most of
interesting.
the time.
I have heard about that research, but I haven't heard anything about the implications of it when it comes to social connection. So that's really interesting. Um, I have come across some of the research on like the hybrid workforce that I think is really interesting as well. That reviews on like the research on telework versus in person find that the sweet spot for feeling connected and satisfied is about 40% telework. So that's like 3 days coming into the office and 2 days staying home, which is my schedule. Yes. So that this hybrid environment tends to be best for us when it comes to connection, but I think that this can also be moderated by workplace culture, right? And so if you want people to come in and connect in the workplace, that sometimes workplaces can be really isolating for people. And it's about creating a culture that people can come to and feel like they can connect and feel authentic and feel like it's welcomed and encouraged for people to, create friendships with each other. Okay,
Awesome.
I see. So just wanted to chime in because I feel like I see a lot of questions about slides and recordings. I don't share my slides, but it's my understanding that a recording of this will be shared internally. And Jason, please feel free to chime in on this.
Yes. Again, if you're on our mailing list, either external or internal, and I'll drop the link to, or not the link, but the email address to send if you want. I'm doing that now. hq.doe.gov. If you're not on our mailing list, email us there. We'll get you on the mailing list, and when the recording is ready, we will go ahead and provide that to everybody. Yeah, so next question. Is there any connection between PTSD and people making connection to each other? Have you seen anything, particular challenges with people in PTSD who have PTSD diagnoses?
Yeah, I mean, PTSD inherent to the diagnosis is that um, first of all, it changes your perception of yourself and others, in which you feel like you are less worthy, which, related to my next book that I'm writing on worthiness, has important implications for your ability to create connection. Because people that feel unworthy, they're actually attracted to relationships with people that treat them more negatively. Because when people treat you positively, you think, I feel like an imposter. They're going to find out who I really am. And in the meantime, I'm very anxious that they will find this out. And I don't trust that they really like me, right? And so our own sense of worthiness can really impact our ability to connect. But the other thing is that, inherent to the diagnosis is just feeling unsafe around other people, right? I mean, you have flashbacks, you have triggers that might come up when something happens in conversation that even crudely reflects the trauma that you went through. It can be even like someone raising their voice a little bit higher than is typical, right? That can trigger that trauma. And so it's hard because it does make it harder to connect with people, but we do know that people that heal from PTSD, one of the factors that predicts healing and even something called post-traumatic growth, which is people that feel like they've gained resources after from going through their trauma, that they've gained new things that improve their lives in some ways, that one of the factors that predicts this healing or this post-traumatic growth is your ability to access that social support. But also that if we have social support and we experience a trauma, it's less likely to become a post-traumatic stress diagnosis. So we become more resilient to our experiences of trauma. And I think that's related to what I talked about in vulnerability, right? And what I talked about with depression, that when we have someone to confide in and be vulnerable with us, psychologically it's cleansing, psychologically it grounds us, psychologically it makes us more resilient in the world. And so I think there's a lot of intersections there, but also just wanted to say that having PTSD is really hard. I mean, this is obvious. And if you're struggling with connection because you have that diagnosis, that is completely understandable. That is part of the experience. That is your brain trying to keep you safe, even if it's creating a lot of frustration for you. And that I just have a lot of empathy for you in your healing process.
Thank you.
Great. And so Dr. Franco, obviously it takes a lot of mental, emotional, physical fortitude to be able to put yourself out there and try to make new connections. When you do experience rejection, either in maybe a potential new friendship or connection, or even maybe a longer term friendship that uh, you are kind of going separate ways. Do you have any strong tips or recommendations that are ways to mitigate that kind of defensive gut reaction that you might feel, and kind of prevent or lessen those walls of those vulnerability walls of going back up?
Yeah. So rejection sucks, and none of us want to experience it, and it's very painful. I mean, yes, so it's understandable that people are like, "Oh, I went through rejection. I want to just crawl back into my hole and never do this again." I will answer based off some science that I've been finding for my new book on worthiness, and it finds that a lot of times we take rejection hard because we have memories of past rejection that are playing into how we are experiencing rejection now. And the thing about our memories is that they aren't static. There's a theory called memory reconsolidation theory, which basically means every time we revisit a memory and we basically add a more positive experience to that memory, it then sits back into our brain in a more positive way. And so what this looks like in the research is that people are asked to think about an experience of rejection, for example, and a memory that they have of it, and then ask themselves, like, what benefits came out of it, what opportunities or offerings came out of it, and then write about those opportunities and offerings. And the research actually finds that literally their brain is different. Like when they draw up that memory again in their hippocampus, the part of your brain that records memories, is different. And so what I would say to people that have gone through rejection is trying to find what benefits or what offerings are in this. I think the benefit or the offering is that if you are getting rejected, you are putting yourself out there. You are gaining a new skill. And you can't control the outcome of that behavior, but you can control your effort. So, how do you judge yourself by an outcome you can control? You can't control. You can only judge yourself by what you can control. And if you judge yourself according to your effort, you have succeeded no matter what the outcome is, because you have engaged in initiation and you have created this new skill. The other thing I want to say is I think it's really helpful when part of the ways we feel really bad about rejection is because we feel shame and we think we're the only ones being rejected. I have been rejected. I put myself out there all the time, which means I'm just more likely to be rejected. Rejection is part of the process of connection. It's not a sign to eject from it. It's not a sign that you're doing something wrong. Like if you're really going for the people that you really want to be friends with, inherently rejection is going to be part of that process. And so this is a step in the larger goal of curating the community that you want. And so you're doing it right.
What a great answer, and what a great what a great note to wrap up on. I know it's 1:30. We're past our time. I'm sorry for the folks we didn't get to all the questions we had, but there's a lot of great questions and of course a lot of great um, comments there. Again, for everybody who wants, I will post, if it's okay with you, Dr. Franco, your Instagram handle
Thank you.
on and website right here in the chat, and as well as the name of your book one more time in case we have people who want to learn more and read more is Platonic: The Science of Attachment can help you make. How the science of attachment can help you make and keep friends. And I'll definitely be keeping an eye out for the next one on uh, uh, worthiness. I think that sounds really interesting. So thank you so much for your
Thank
time
you so much,
today.
everybody. Happy Conflict Resolution Day. Happy friending. One last thing, for friendship to happen, someone has to be brave. So I hope you'll be brave. Bye.
All right. Thank you all so much.